There's a pattern in history that most people miss. Empires rise, empires fall, and usually they stay fallen. The Romans never came back. The Ottomans never returned. The Spanish Empire faded into history. But China keeps collapsing, and then coming back stronger every single time. Stronger government, bigger economy, more global power. Experts say China is declining right now. Aging population, debt crisis, slowing growth. But here's the problem. They've been saying that since 1989, and they've been wrong every single time. Before you believe them now, you need to understand why China keeps proving everyone wrong. Consider the evidence. In 1911, a dynasty that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries simply ceased to exist. The country shattered into warlord territories. Then came the Japanese invasion, one of the most brutal occupations in modern warfare, leaving 20 million dead. After that, a civil war that displaced millions more. In the late 1950s, government policy caused a famine that killed somewhere between 15 and 55 million people, the deadliest famine in human history. A decade later, the Cultural Revolution shut down universities, exiled intellectuals, and froze development for 10 years. In 1989, the Tiananmen Square crackdown left China internationally isolated. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis toppled currencies across the region. 2008 brought the global financial crisis when global trade collapsed. And just a few years ago, COVID-19 and the zero-COVID lockdowns caused China's steepest economic contraction in decades. Each of these events would have permanently crippled most countries. Many civilizations have ended with less. Yet after every single one of these catastrophes, China didn't just recover. It emerged with a more sophisticated government, a larger economy, and renewed political legitimacy. The question isn't whether China bounces back, the question is how. What allows a civilization to absorb punishment that would destroy others? Why doesn't it fragment permanently like Yugoslavia, or stagnate like post-Soviet Russia did for years, or become a failed state like Somalia? The answer isn't simple, and it isn't comfortable. It involves a combination of ruthless pragmatism, centralized state power, gradual rather than revolutionary change, and a willingness to learn from each disaster. It involves sacrifice on a scale that's hard to comprehend. But most importantly, it involves something deeper, a kind of institutional memory and cultural continuity that survives even when the government itself collapses. What we're going to explore isn't a celebration of any political system. It's a forensic examination of resilience itself. By the time we're done, you'll understand not just what happened, but why it keeps happening, and what that means for the world we're living in now. Let's start at the beginning, with a collapse so total that it ended thousands of years of imperial rule. 1911. The Qing Dynasty, which had governed China since 1644, was dying. For decades, internal rebellions had bled the empire. The Taiping Rebellion alone, from 1850 to 1864, killed at least 20 million people. Foreign powers had carved out concessions in Chinese cities, humiliating the Qing in war after war, the Opium Wars, the Sino-Japanese War, the Boxer Rebellion. By the early 20th century, the dynasty was hollowed out, corrupt, incapable of defending its people or modernizing its economy. Intellectuals were reading forbidden translations of Western political theory. Military officers were plotting in secret. The imperial system had lasted for millennia, but in 1911, it took only a single spark to bring it down. The Xinhai Revolution began almost accidentally, with a railway dispute and a bomb that exploded prematurely in Wuhan. Within weeks, province after province declared independence from the Qing. On February 12, 1912, the last emperor, a 6-year-old boy named Puyi, abdicated. Thousands of years of dynastic rule ended not with a grand battle, but with a child's signature on a document. In its place came the Republic of China, led nominally by Sun Yat-sen, a revolutionary who had spent years in exile. For a brief moment, it seemed like China might become a modern republic, a democracy even. That illusion didn't last long. Sun Yat-sen stepped aside almost immediately in favor of Yuan Shikai, a powerful military general who promised to hold the country together. Yuan had been a Qing loyalist, but he saw which way the wind was blowing. He took power and almost immediately betrayed the revolution's ideals. He dissolved the parliament, banned opposition parties, and in 1915 declared himself emperor. His empire lasted 83 days before he was forced to abandon the attempt. He died the next year, and with his death, the fragile Republic of China collapsed into what historians call the warlord era. Imagine a country the size of China with hundreds of millions of people, divided among dozens of military strongmen, each controlling a province or a region, each with their own army, their own currency, their own laws. There was no central government, there was no national economy. Warlords fought constantly, shifting alliances, hiring mercenaries, taxing peasants into starvation. It was, by any measure, a failed state. Bandits roamed the countryside. Famine was common. In the cities, intellectuals launched the New Culture movement and the May 4th movement, desperate attempts to modernize Chinese thought by rejecting Confucian tradition and embracing science, democracy, and individual rights. They published magazines, translated Western books, and argued that China's weakness came from its outdated culture. Meanwhile, in the countryside, warlords ruled like medieval lords. This is where most collapsed empires stay collapsed. Fragmentation becomes permanent. Think of the Holy Roman Empire after the 30 Years' War, or the post-colonial states of Africa that never fully unified. But China didn't stay fragmented, and the reason is both simple and brutal. Someone was willing to use military force to reunify the country, and they had the foreign backing to do it. That someone was the Kuomintang, the KMT, the Nationalist Party, reorganized by Sun Yat-sen in the early 1920s with help from the Soviet Union. Yes, the Soviet Union. The Soviets sent advisors, weapons, and money to help the KMT build a modern army. They even helped train officers at the Whampoa Military Academy, where a young officer named Chiang Kai-shek was rising through the ranks. In 1926, after Sun Yat-sen's death, Chiang Kai-shek launched the Northern Expedition, a military campaign to defeat the warlords and reunify China under a single government. It took 2 years. The KMT army fought its way north, defeating warlord after warlord, sometimes through battle, sometimes through negotiation and bribery. By 1928, Chiang declared China unified under a nationalist government based in Nanjing. It wasn't a complete victory. Warlords still controlled some regions, and the communists, who had briefly allied with the KMT, were now being hunted and purged. But for the first time since 1912, China had a government that most of the country recognized. This is the first pattern of Chinese resilience. Political fragmentation is solved through centralization, often violent centralization. The KMT didn't reunify China through democratic elections or philosophical debate. They did it with guns and military discipline, backed by foreign support and nationalist ideology. And once they had power, they started rebuilding. The Nanjing government of the late 1920s and early 1930s invested in railways, roads, banks, and factories. Shanghai became one of the most modern cities in Asia, with skyscrapers, universities, and a thriving industrial working class. Urban China was recovering. But this recovery was fragile, and it was about to be destroyed by something far worse than warlords. On July 7, 1937, Japanese and Chinese troops exchanged fire at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing. It was the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War, and it would be one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. Japan had already occupied Manchuria in 1931, but now it launched a full-scale invasion. Within months, Japanese forces captured Beijing, then Shanghai, then Nanjing. What happened in Nanjing is almost too horrific to describe. Over 6 weeks in December 1937 and January 1938, Japanese soldiers massacred at least 260,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. Some estimates go much higher. Women were raped systematically. Entire neighborhoods were burned. Bodies filled the streets and the Yangtze River. The Nanjing Massacre, or the Rape of Nanjing, remains one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. But Nanjing was just the beginning. The war lasted 8 years. Japanese forces occupied much of eastern and central China, the richest and most populated regions. They destroyed factories, burned villages, and used chemical weapons. Entire cities were bombed into rubble. The nationalist government retreated inland to Chongqing, deep in the mountainous interior, and continued fighting with support from the United States and Britain. Meanwhile, the Communist Party, which had been nearly destroyed by Chiang's purges in the early 1930s, regrouped in the northwest and waged guerrilla warfare against the Japanese. Both the KMT and the CCP claimed to be defending China, and both were, in their own way, though they hated each other nearly as much as they hated the Japanese. By the time the war ended in 1945, after the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but China was devastated. Estimates of Chinese deaths range from 15 to 20 million, most of them civilians. The economy was in ruins, infrastructure was destroyed. Farms had been burned, cities occupied, and millions displaced. And yet, China had survived. It was recognized as one of the Allied victors and became a founding member of the United Nations with a permanent seat on the Security Council. That recognition mattered. It gave China legitimacy on the world stage. But domestically, the country was exhausted and broken, and the peace didn't last. Almost immediately after Japan surrendered, the civil war between the nationalists and the communists resumed. Both sides had spent the war preparing for this moment. The KMT controlled the cities and had American support, weapons, and money. The communists controlled the countryside and had peasant support, built through years of land reform and guerrilla organizing. Chiang Kai-shek's government was corrupt, authoritarian, and increasingly unpopular. Inflation was out of control. In some cities, prices doubled every few days. People carried money in wheelbarrows. The nationalist army was large but demoralized. Meanwhile, Mao Zedong's communist forces were disciplined, motivated, and spreading across northern China like wildfire. By 1949, it was over. Chiang and the remnants of his government fled to Taiwan. On October 1st, 1949, Mao stood in Tiananmen Square and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. The Chinese people, he said, have stood up. It was a moment of triumph, but also a moment of profound uncertainty. The new government controlled a country that had been at war in one form or another for nearly 40 years. The economy was shattered. Literacy rates were abysmal. Infrastructure barely existed outside a few cities. Most of the population lived in desperate poverty. How do you rebuild from that? The Communist Party's answer was radical and Soviet-inspired. They launched immediate land reform, confiscating land from landlords and redistributing it to peasants. Landlords were tried in public courts, often in violent campaigns that left hundreds of thousands dead. It was brutal, but it was also popular among the peasant majority who had been exploited for generations. Then came the first 5-year plan, launched in 1953, modelled directly on Stalin's industrialization of the Soviet Union. The focus was heavy industry, steel mills, coal mines, hydroelectric dams, railways. Soviet advisors flooded into China. Factories were built from scratch. The results were dramatic. Steel production nearly quadrupled in just 4 years, from 1.3 million tons in 1952 to 5.2 million tons by 1957. Coal, machinery, and electricity production all soared. This is the second pattern. After collapse, China doesn't experiment with decentralization or free markets. It consolidates power under a strong central government and invests massively in infrastructure and heavy industry, usually with foreign help. In the 1950s, that foreign help came from the Soviet Union. But the strategy was effective. By the mid-1950s, China was no longer a failed state. It had a functioning government, a growing industrial base, and a sense of national purpose. The Korean War, where Chinese troops fought American-led UN forces to a stalemate, boosted the new government's legitimacy even further. China had proven it could stand up to the West. But then came one of the most catastrophic policy decisions in human history. In 1958, Mao Zedong launched the Great Leap Forward, an attempt to rapidly industrialize and collectivize agriculture. Mao believed China could surpass Britain in steel production within 15 years. He ordered the creation of massive rural communes where peasants would farm collectively and produce steel in backyard furnaces. Local officials, desperate to meet impossible quotas, lied about grain production. The government, believing the lies, requisitioned grain that didn't exist. Peasants starved. The backyard furnaces produced useless pig iron. The entire economy collapsed. Between 1959 and 1961, somewhere between 15 and 55 million people died of starvation. It remains the deadliest famine in recorded history, and it was entirely man-made. This should have been the end of the communist government. Famines have toppled regimes throughout history, but the CCP didn't fall. Why? Because by 1962, pragmatic leaders within the party, President Liu Shaoqi and Premier Zhou Enlai, quietly sidelined Mao and reversed his policies. They downsized the communes, allowed families to farm small private plots, and gave local officials more flexibility. These reforms worked. From 1962 to 1965, the economy grew strongly. Agricultural production recovered, industrial output stabilized. The famine ended not because the ideology changed, but because the implementation became more realistic. This is the third pattern. China's leadership is willing to abandon failed policies, at least eventually, when the evidence of failure becomes undeniable. It's a form of pragmatism, though one that often comes too late and at enormous human cost. But the willingness to course-correct, even within an authoritarian system, is part of what allows recovery. The Soviet Union, by contrast, often doubled down on failed policies for ideological reasons. China, at least after 1962, proved more flexible. But Mao wasn't done. His authority had been weakened by the Great Leap Forward, and in 1966, he launched the Cultural Revolution to reassert control. This time, the target wasn't the economy, but Chinese society itself. Mao called on young people to rebel against authority to destroy the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, old habits. Red Guards, mostly teenagers and university students, rampaged across the country. They attacked intellectuals, destroyed temples and historical sites, and publicly humiliated anyone accused of bourgeois tendencies. Universities closed. Engineers and doctors were sent to the countryside for re-education. The country descended into chaos. Economically, growth stagnated. Socially, an entire generation lost years of education. The Cultural Revolution lasted a decade until Mao's death in 1976. By then, China was exhausted. The population was traumatized. The economy had stagnated for 10 years while Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan were booming. When Mao died, the question was whether China could ever recover or whether it would remain a poor, isolated, revolutionary state forever. The answer came from an unlikely source, a man named Deng Xiaoping, who had been purged twice during the Cultural Revolution and sent to work in a factory. Deng was a survivor, a pragmatist, and in 1978, after outmaneuvering Mao's chosen successor, he took control of the government and launched what would become the most successful economic transformation in modern history. Deng's approach was simple. It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. In other words, ideology mattered less than results. He began cautiously with agricultural reform. The communes were essentially dismantled, though not officially abolished. Instead, families were allowed to contract land from the collective and keep any surplus they produced above a quota. This was called the household responsibility system, and it was revolutionary. Almost overnight, productivity exploded. Farmers who could now keep their profits worked harder and grew more. Agricultural output increased by roughly 25% between 1975 and 1985. Rural incomes soared. Famine, which had haunted China for decades, essentially ended. Next came industrial reform. Deng introduced a dual-track system. State-owned enterprises still had to meet production quotas at fixed prices, but they could sell anything above the quota at market prices. This created an incentive to produce more. Private businesses, which had been banned for decades, were legalized. Township and village enterprises, small factories owned by local governments, sprang up across the countryside. They made everything from textiles to electronics, and they competed with state-owned firms. Some failed, but many thrived, and they created millions of jobs. Then came the opening to the outside world. Deng created special economic zones in cities like Shenzhen, Zhuhai, and Xiamen. These were essentially capitalist experiments within a socialist country. Foreign companies could set up factories, import technology, and export goods with minimal regulation. Tax breaks and cheap labor made these zones incredibly attractive to investors from Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, and eventually the the West. Shenzhen, which had been a small fishing village in 1979, became a city of millions within a decade, filled with factories producing toys, electronics, and clothing for the world market. The results were extraordinary. GDP growth accelerated to double digits and stayed there for years. Between 1980 and 2000, China's economy grew faster than any major country in history. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty. Cities exploded in size. A new middle class emerged. And critically, China did all of this without political liberalization. The Communist Party remained in control. There were no free elections, no independent judiciary, no free press. Deng had found a way to introduce market economics without relinquishing political power. This is the fourth pattern. China's recoveries are not ideologically pure. They involve pragmatic borrowing from whatever works, whether that's Soviet planning in the 1950s, capitalist markets in the 1980s, or a hybrid state capitalist model today. The key is that the state remains in control throughout, guiding and directing the process rather than stepping aside. This is fundamentally different from the shock therapy approach taken by Russia and Eastern Europe in the 1990s, where governments collapsed and markets were opened all at once. Deng's approach was gradualist, crossing the river by feeling the stones, as he put it. Successful local experiments were scaled up. Failures were quietly abandoned. But Deng's reforms created new tensions. Economic opening brought ideas about political freedom. By the late 1980s, students and intellectuals were demanding democracy, freedom of speech, and an end to corruption. In the spring of 1989, protests erupted, across China, centered in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. For weeks, hundreds of thousands of people gathered peacefully, calling for reform. The government was divided on how to respond. Some leaders, like Premier Zhao Ziyang, sympathized with the protesters. Others, including Deng himself, saw the protests as a threat to Communist Party rule. On the night of June 3rd and into June 4th, the government sent troops and tanks into Beijing. The exact death toll is unknown. Estimates range from hundreds to over 1,000, but the message was clear. Political reform was off the table. The Tiananmen crackdown shocked the world. Western countries imposed sanctions and arms embargoes. Foreign investment slowed. Within China, conservatives in the Communist Party argued that economic reform had gone too far, that it was leading to social instability and Western subversion. For a couple of years, reform stalled. China's economy slowed. There was a real possibility that the country might retreat from the global economy, that the opening of the 1980s might be reversed. And then Deng acted. In early 1992, Deng, then 87 years old and officially retired, made a tour of southern China visiting the special economic zones. He gave speeches praising reform and attacking conservatives who wanted to slow down. He didn't have formal power anymore, but his words carried enormous weight. The southern tour, as it became known, was a clear signal. Reform would continue, politics would remain closed, but the economy would keep opening. It worked. Growth resumed. Foreign investment poured back in. By the mid-1990s, China was growing at 9 to 10% a year again. The Tiananmen crackdown had been brutal, but economically, China had recovered. This is the fifth pattern. Political repression and economic growth can coexist, at least for a time. The Chinese leadership learned that as long as living standards keep rising, most people will tolerate authoritarianism. It's not a universal rule. Plenty of authoritarian regimes have failed economically, but in China's case, the strategy worked. The government maintained legitimacy not through democracy, but through economic performance, and that performance was about to be tested again. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis erupted. It started in Thailand, where the currency collapsed under speculative attack. Within weeks, the contagion spread to Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, and the Philippines. Currencies plummeted, stock markets crashed, governments fell. The International Monetary Fund imposed harsh austerity programs in exchange for bailouts. Across East Asia, economies that had been booming for decades suddenly contracted. Indonesia's GDP shrank by 13% in a single year. South Korea had to be rescued with a $57 billion IMF loan. It was one of the worst financial crises in modern history. China, by all rights, should have been hit hard. Its banking system was fragile, loaded with bad loans to state-owned enterprises. Its currency, the yuan, was under pressure. Foreign investors were pulling money out of Asia. But China didn't collapse. In fact, China's growth barely slowed. GDP growth dropped from 8.9% in 1997 to 7.1% by 1999, a slowdown but not a disaster. Why did China escape when its neighbors didn't? The answer is capital controls. Unlike Thailand or South Korea, China had never fully opened its financial markets. Foreign investors couldn't easily move money in and out of the country. The yuan wasn't freely convertible. This meant speculators couldn't attack the currency the way they had attacked the Thai baht. China's government refused to devalue the yuan, even though doing so might have boosted exports. Instead, they kept the currency stable and relied on fiscal policy to support growth. They also reformed the banking system, quietly writing off bad debts and recapitalizing state banks. And remarkably, China even provided $4 billion in aid to crisis-hit neighbors, positioning itself as a responsible regional power. This is the sixth pattern. China's partially closed economy, which Western economists often criticize as inefficient, acts as a buffer during global financial crises. The lack of full capital mobility means China is less vulnerable to capital flight and speculative attacks. It's a form of economic insulation. And in 1997, that insulation worked. China's policymakers learned a crucial lesson. Don't rush to open capital markets and maintain policy space to respond to crises on your own terms. When the IMF and Western economists pushed for faster liberalization, China resisted, and history proved them right to do so. The Asian financial crisis also pushed China to accelerate domestic reforms. In the late 1990s, the government restructured or privatized thousands of small and medium state-owned enterprises. Millions of workers were laid off, causing significant social pain, but the economy became more efficient. By 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, cementing its integration into the global economy. The 2000s would be China's boom decade. Exports exploded. Manufacturing became the engine of growth. Coastal cities filled with factories making everything from iPhones to furniture. China became the world's workshop. By 2010, it was the world's second-largest economy. But in 2008, another crisis hit, this time originating in the United States. The global financial crisis started with the collapse of subprime mortgages, but quickly spread worldwide. Banks failed, credit froze, global trade collapsed. In the final quarter of 2008, China's exports fell by nearly 25% compared to the year before. Factories shut down. Millions of migrant workers lost their jobs and returned to their villages. For a few months, it looked like China's miracle growth might be over. The government's response was immediate and overwhelming. In November 2008, Beijing announced a 4 trillion yuan stimulus package, roughly $586 billion, about 12% of GDP. This was one of the largest stimulus programs relative to GDP in modern history. The money went primarily into infrastructure, high-speed railways, highways, airports, urban transit, power plants. It also included some spending on social programs like healthcare and pensions, but infrastructure was the core. At the same time, the central bank slashed interest rates and loosened credit. State-owned banks were told to lend aggressively, and they did. Money flooded into the economy. The results were dramatic. China's growth slowed only briefly, dipping to around 6% in early 2009 and then roared back to double digits by the end of the year. In 2010, China grew at over 10%, while the United States, Europe, and Japan were struggling through recession and slow recovery. China was booming again. By some estimates, Chinese infrastructure investment accounted for a significant share of global economic growth during the crisis years. China had essentially pulled itself and part of the world economy out of recession. This is the seventh pattern. China's state-controlled banking system and ability to direct investment gives it enormous counter-cyclical firepower. When private investment collapses, state investment can fill the gap almost instantly. Western economies had to debate stimulus packages, pass legislation, and convince banks to lend. In China, the government simply ordered banks to lend and local governments to spend. It was fast, decisive, and effective, at least in the short term. But that stimulus also created problems. The surge in lending inflated asset bubbles, especially in real estate. Local governments, which didn't have the tax base to repay loans, borrowed heavily and built infrastructure that sometimes wasn't economically justified: empty highways, underused airports. Corporate debt soared. By the mid-2010s, China was dealing with the consequences: a debt overhang, overcapacity in heavy industry, and a property market that some analysts feared could crash. These problems haven't gone away. But in the immediate aftermath of 2008, the stimulus worked. China recovered faster than any other major economy, and in doing so, demonstrated its economic resilience once again. Then came the pandemic. In late December 2019, reports emerged from Wuhan of a mysterious respiratory illness. By January 2020, it was clear that a novel coronavirus was spreading rapidly. China's response was the most extreme public health intervention in modern history. In late January, the government locked down Wuhan, a city of 11 million people. Then, it locked down Hubei province, then parts of other provinces. Schools, factories, shops, and offices closed. People were ordered to stay home. Drones patrolled the streets, and neighborhood committees monitored every building. The lockdowns were enforced by a combination of police, health workers, and digital surveillance. Mobile apps tracked people's health status, and QR codes determined who could enter public spaces. The economic impact was immediate and severe. In the first quarter of 2020, China's GDP contracted by 6.8%, the first contraction in decades. Factories shut down. Exports collapsed. Consumer spending evaporated. For a few months, the world's second-largest economy simply stopped. But by late spring, China began reopening. The lockdowns had worked, domestic transmission was nearly eliminated. Factories restarted. Workers returned. And critically, global demand for Chinese goods exploded. As people around the world stayed home, they bought electronics, furniture, home exercise equipment, all made in China. Chinese exports actually soared during the pandemic, growing by more than 20% in some months. China's recovery from the initial shock was swift. By the second half of 2020, GDP was growing again, and by 2021, growth was back to pre-pandemic trends in real terms. The government provided some stimulus, tax cuts, targeted lending, infrastructure investment, but nothing like the massive response in 2008. The real advantage was that China controlled the virus faster than almost any other country, allowing production to resume while competitors were still locked down. China's manufacturing capacity and export sector thrived even as domestic consumption lagged. But the story didn't end there. In late 2021, the Omicron variant arrived, far more transmissible than earlier strains. China's zero-COVID policy, which relied on strict lockdowns and mass testing to eliminate outbreaks, became increasingly difficult to maintain. Through 2022, major cities faced rolling lockdowns. Shanghai, China's financial capital, was locked down for 2 months in spring 2022. The economic cost mounted. GDP growth slowed to around 3% for the year, well below the government's target. Consumer confidence collapsed. Youth unemployment soared. Property developers defaulted on debts. For the first time in decades, there was real pessimism about China's economic future. And then, abruptly, the government changed course. In December 2022, Beijing abandoned zero COVID with almost no warning. Restrictions were lifted. Testing requirements disappeared. The virus spread rapidly through the population, but the wave passed relatively quickly. By early 2023, life was returning to normal. Consumption began recovering. Services rebounded. Exports, which had stayed strong through the pandemic, continued growing. Early estimates suggest China's GDP grew around 5% in 2023. Not spectacular by historical standards, but solid given the circumstances. This is the 8th pattern. China's authoritarian system allows for rapid, dramatic policy shifts that would be nearly impossible in democracies. The same system that imposed the world's strictest lockdowns could also abandon them overnight. There's no debate, no negotiation with interest groups, no election to worry about. When the leadership decides to change course, the change happens. This has costs. People have little say in policies that affect their lives profoundly, but it also allows for speed and decisiveness that can be an advantage in crises. So what does all of this tell us? Why does China keep rising after every collapse? The answer isn't a single factor, it's a combination of mechanisms that reinforce each other. Let's break them down. First, state capacity. China has a large, sophisticated bureaucracy that survives political upheavals. When dynasties fall or governments change, the administrative machinery remains. Civil servants, provincial officials, tax collectors, infrastructure planners. This continuity means that even after catastrophic disruptions, the state can reorganize and start functioning again relatively quickly. Contrast this with, say, Libya after Gaddafi or Iraq after Saddam, where state institutions essentially dissolved. In China, the state is resilient because it's embedded deeply in society and has thousands of years of institutional memory. Second, centralized political power. Every recovery in modern Chinese history has involved a strong central government reasserting control. Whether it was the KMT reunifying China in the 1920s, the CCP consolidating power in the 1950s, or Deng's reforms in the 1980s, the pattern is the same. Fragmentation is ended through centralization, often by force, and then the central government directs resources toward rebuilding.